Hey friends, and welcome back. Today what I would like to do is talk to you a little bit more about what I call the elements of health. Last week I went into my top 3 tips that any wellness practitioner can do in order to maintain their health and wellness. But there's a lot more to it than that, and as I mentioned, this is what I call the elements of health. Fair warning, this is going to be a little bit of a longer video because we have a fair bit of material to cover. So before I really dig into that, I'll give you a little bit of background about how I came up with this idea in the first place. When I first graduated as an acupuncturist and doctor of traditional Chinese medicine, I wasn't practicing massage at all in the very beginning. It wasn't until a little bit later on that I started to incorporate more and more massage into my practice. And for those first 2 or 3 years, I was a jack of all trades. I saw anybody dealing with any issue. Didn't matter if it was a sore shoulder or a gynecological issue or digestive problems. I saw everybody. As I'm sure many of you can relate with, that's actually not the best way to practice. As time went on, I started to refine my practice more and more. And I ended up dealing with a lot of people dealing with chronic illness, serious autoimmune conditions, and things like this. Now that was incredibly challenging. Spending my days, day in and day out, working with people suffering from very serious chronic illness, it took a toll. It took a toll on myself, it took a toll on my relationships, and quite frankly, I wasn't enjoying my practice. But I ended up doing that for about 5 years. Now within those 5 years, although it was challenging, I'm incredibly grateful for that experience. Because working day in and day out with people dealing with very serious chronic illness taught me a lot about the practice of medicine. Not only how to practice as a doctor of Chinese medicine, but also how to practice as a massage therapist. It taught me how to interact with my clients completely differently. See, what ended up happening is when I was dealing with these people who were very, very ill, I would see what needed to happen in order for them to start to improve their health and well-being. Things like making dietary changes or regular exercise. But you tell somebody who's got chronic fatigue syndrome and dealing with a very high degree of inflammation in their entire body to exercise more, maybe spend an extra 20 minutes or anything like that. And quite frankly, it's not realistic. To some of you, 20 minutes of exercise may sound like nothing. But I can tell you from experience, and this is both personal experience as well as working with my clients, for many people, doing 20 minutes of exercise, it's just unrealistic. They simply can't do it because of their illness. So this taught me how to work with a client and meet them where they are at. And it also taught me how to build, using these tiny little steps, a wellness routine and a wellness program that's sustainable, that anybody can do. So this is really where it all began. Now, after I realized that I wasn't really that interested in working with people who had chronic illness, I shifted the focus of my practice quite a bit. Now, at this point in time in my career, I was also starting to practice a lot more massage therapy. I shifted my practice to working with people who felt relatively healthy but were aiming for optimal. I really dealt with a lot of people who, say, were recovering from an injury and attempting to get back to their former state of health. I also started coaching a lot more. I worked with a lot of people who simply wanted to be their best self, aiming for optimal, and I found this incredibly invigorating. I enjoyed this form of practice more than virtually any other form of practice. And I applied those exact same skills that I learned in those first years of dealing with chronic cases to virtually everybody else. Meet people where they are at. Start small and build big. And throughout not only my time working with people who were very ill, but also in working with people who were aiming for optimal, I realized there's only 7 different things a person has to do. 7 may sound like a lot, but it's really not that many. There are 7 elements of health, 7 fundamental areas of our life that if we focus on and we apply the appropriate techniques and we approach these different areas with that same compassion that we would if we're working with somebody who is ill, we can make massive changes in our overall health and well-being. So that's the origin story behind the elements of health. But now what I want to do is I want to give you everything that you could possibly need in order to work on each of these areas and improve your life. So let's now dig into each of these 7 elements. We're going to go through each one in order and spend time on each one, but first let's review them from a high level. What's important is the order of these elements. It actually does matter, particularly the first 3 elements. Without these first 3 elements, Everything else we do has a much smaller impact. And within those first three, they are also ordered from what I believe is the most important fundamental element moving up from there. So the elements are going to be number 1, sleep. Element number 2 is going to be movement or exercise, but I prefer the word movement. And then we have nutrition. Once we get out of these basic elements, the fundamental elements, we then move into the rest of them. And from there, we go into stress management. We go into nature and time outside. After that, we talk about relationships. That's the 6th element. And then the 7th element is going to be meaning and purpose. So again, we should be focusing on these in order. Once we get out of the first 3, though, you can start to play around with which element you focus on. Let's now talk about them in order, starting with sleep. Now, I talked a fair bit about sleep in my last video. You could check that link out up here. But within that, when we talk about sleep, I gave a lot of different advice. Now, sleep is a huge topic. In fact, each of these elements are. We could spend literally hours talking about each one. But my goal here is to give you the resources where you can dig in and figure out how to best manage and improve each of these elements. So my advice with sleep, if I were to keep it as brief as possible. Number 1, do your very best to avoid doing anything before bedtime that's going to disrupt your ability to fall asleep and stay asleep. And basically, this is going to be making sure that you don't consume any caffeine after, say, 2 or 3 o'clock, making sure that your room is of the appropriate temperature.
What's going on in here? Why is it so hot? Someone fiddled with the thermostat. What?
Now, of course, this can be very challenging if you live in a warm climate and don't have air conditioning, but temperature plays a huge role in our ability to fall and stay asleep. And then the last thing is to make sure you've got a consistent sleep routine, that you're going to bed around the same time and waking up around the same time. Now, I say this as if it's all simple, and of course it's really not. Each one of these practices it takes time to establish and work at, but they're really important to work at. Now, again, because it could take 3 hours or more to go through each one of these, what I have done is in the description below this video, I've linked to a lot of different resources, particularly books. So if you're focused on one of these elements or the other, all of the resources are there, so you can really dig deep into each one of these topics. All right, so after sleep, the next element is going to be movement. Now, the reason I say movement instead of exercise is because for a lot of people, saying the word exercise, well, it just doesn't feel great. They don't want to exercise. The idea of having to go to the gym, they don't want to do it. And I learned this first when I was working with my chronic illness clients. Telling them to exercise, well, immediately they get this look on their face like, oh, I don't have the energy for that. But saying, we need to incorporate some movement into your life, they'd be like, yeah, okay, I can do that. Because movement is a much broader thing. And that's important because what's more important, in my opinion, than specific exercises is the fact that we're moving our body. Now, when we talk about the best type of movement and the most effective way to incorporate movement in your life, that can be quite challenging because every single person is different. But there are a few very broad rules. The first thing is move your body every single day. Without exception, move your body. This might be consciously getting up and going for a walk. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, I really don't care, so long as you're moving. Certainly, the more time we spend moving, the better. There is an improvement or an increase in the amount of improvement when we move our body more. But little is better than none at all. So move your body. I don't care if it's walking, if it's yoga, if it's skipping rope, if it's swimming. It really doesn't matter so long as you move your body every single day. Now, when we get into optimizing movement practices, that's when things start to change. How can you improve or get the most out of your cardiovascular exercise? How can you get the most out of your weight training exercise? So there's a lot more information. And again, I've linked to all the resources down below so you can really dig in to the research and what we now know about the best way to optimize any movement routine. Now, once we've got movement, we then focus on nutrition. And this might seem strange because nutrition for many people is the very first place they start when they try and improve their well-being. And quite frankly, I used to be the exact same way. Not only with myself, but with my clients, the very first thing I would do is start to work on their diet. But then I realized if a person isn't sleeping well and they're not moving their body on a regular basis, changing diet doesn't actually have that big of an effect. On the other hand, if you are sleeping relatively well or great and you are moving your body, then changing your diet has a massive effect. So, when we talk about diet and nutrition, again, it can be a huge topic and get quite complicated, but I really like the rules laid out by Michael Pollan. And he says very simply, eat real food, mostly plants, not too much. That's it. Eat real food. Reduce refined foods. If it comes in a bag or a package or you read the ingredients and it's got more than 3, it's a refined food. So try and eliminate those as much as possible. Eat real food. The next is mostly plants. Now, I'm not an advocate for a vegan diet or vegetarian, and I'm not an advocate for a paleo or keto diet. I'm an advocate for eating real food, and no matter what you're doing, eat mostly plants. And those plants should be in a real food form. Ideally, it's a lot of greens. The more greens, the better. Incorporating other type of plant-based foods is great. Things like potatoes and carbohydrates like rice, fine, but green is best. When it comes to meat, if you choose to eat meat, there is a minimal amount of requirement that we need, and it really depends on your physical exercise. If you're exercising more, you need more protein. If you're exercising a bit less, you need less protein. So again, that gets into individual differences. The last is not too much. There's a ton of research out there about longevity related to the amount of food we eat. And there's a lot of research talking about one's overall health and vitality, again, related to quantity. Quantity matters. Now, we could really get into this whole idea of calories in and calories out and how having too much calories is detrimental for your health. Ultimately, not too much means never eat until you're stuffed. If you want to get serious about it, you can try and track your calories using a calorie tracker like MyFitnessPal. But for a lot of people, that's overwhelming. So I simply say, stop eating when you're no longer hungry. If in a couple hours you're hungry again, go ahead and eat. Now, if you've got individual issues and different diseases and illnesses, that advice might not hold true. So, of course, when it comes to diet and nutrition, in fact, when it comes to any of these elements, each person is different. And part of your responsibility is to figure out what's best for you. So again, check out the links and the resources down below, and you'll find much more information on where to go for information on nutrition. Now, after we're out of these 3 foundational elements, we can move along to the rest of the elements. And again, which order you focus on them doesn't really matter. After we have these first 3 under control, everything else improves about the same amount. But I like to next move into stress management because I've found for most of my clients that I deal with, after we've got those first 3 figured out, stress is the next big aggravating factor and the thing preventing them from ultimately reaching their health and wellness goals. When we talk about stress management, it really boils down to figuring out how to A, reduce the amount of stress we have in life, if possible, and B, and much more importantly, learning how to manage our reaction and response to stressful situations. Now, the reason I think it's so unbelievably important to manage stress and deal with stress is because it turns out if we were to look at the top 10 causes of death in North America outside of acute injury and traumatic accident, of them all, there's only one thing they all have in common that aggravates them and in some cases causes them, and that's stress. Stress is a universal irritant when we talk about anything a person is dealing with, even down to musculoskeletal conditions. When you've got a sore shoulder and you're stressed out, that shoulder is more painful. So managing stress makes virtually every other area of our life better. Also, managing stress helps us get better sleep. Managing stress improves our appetite and gives us the capacity to choose foods a little bit better. So when we talk about stress reduction or stress management techniques, rather, the best thing out there is meditation. Now again, meditation, it's this huge topic. There are so many different types of meditation. And once I say meditation, a lot of people are going to be like, okay, I'm done. I tap out. I don't want to meditate. Tried it, been there, done that, don't like it. I get it. But it really is the best word we have. Basically what I'm talking about here is just taking a couple minutes and taking a few deep breaths, consciously and mindfully focusing on your breath. Maybe a better word might be mindfulness, but again, that's got a lot of baggage to it. So when we talk about the best thing a person could do to manage their stress or deal with stress, it's just to stop, close your eyes, take a couple of deep breaths. And I hate to oversimplify it, but really, ultimately, that's it. Again, if you want more information, check out the links in the description below. All right, next we have nature and time outside. And this might seem like it's coming out of left field. It doesn't show up on a lot of people's list of things we can do to improve their health. But I believe it's a very important element of health. We spent our entire evolution up until incredibly recently on the evolutionary timeline living and being outside. And by incredibly recently, I mean a couple hundred years. Because even a few hundred years ago, the very vast majority of humans, we spent most of our time outside. We would sleep indoors, but during the day, almost everybody was outside laboring or working. So really, our entire body, every aspect of our physiology is tuned in to nature. And the more time we spend exposing ourselves to nature and being in nature, the more in tune with our own physiology we tend to be. Now, there's a lot more to it. It turns out our circadian rhythm, meaning when we wake and when we go to sleep, well, it's determined by the sun. It turns out that our mood is also strongly affected by being exposed to nature, in particular the colors that show themselves in nature, the wavelengths of light that go into our eyes when we're out in nature. Now, beyond that, we can get into what happens when you walk barefoot on the earth. I mean, purely physiologically speaking, walking barefoot improves our balance. It improves ankle and foot strength and well-being. But on top of that, there's a bit of evidence, it's definitely not peer-reviewed, I'll make sure that's known, talking about the grounding effect of simply standing on earth. So the health benefits are vast of spending time outside. Now, it doesn't have to be a lot of time. In fact, if it's nice outside, really 5 minutes is enough. But the more, the merrier. If you could spend all day, every day outside, I guarantee you will feel better. But a little bit is better than none at all. But what happens if you live in a place in which, like myself, on a day like today, it's minus 30 degrees Celsius? What do? Well, you go outside. You bundle up and you go for a walk around the block. It's not really that fun if you don't like being cold, but it's still important. And again, it doesn't have to be long durations. Our sixth element is going to be relationships. I strongly believe that building and maintaining very high quality relationships is essential and fundamental to our health and well-being. Now, when we talk about building relationships, that's actively working on a relationship. What happens a lot of the time with relationships we've had for a long time, be it a relationship with a significant other or a friend, or maybe you've got children, is we tend to stop putting effort into the relationship and the relationship begins to deteriorate. But by consistently putting effort into a relationship, the dividends, the return on that time and energy investment, it's vast, so long as the relationship is quality. Meaning the person in which you're relating with is also investing in that relationship. Now, there's a lot more to it than that, of course. In the same way that we evolved outside, we evolved in social community. We evolved interacting with other people. And we know very conclusively, particularly after the COVID-19 pandemic, that isolation is truly devastating to one's health. So spending time with other people, particularly people you care about, really improves our general well-being. And now the last element is meaning or purpose. And this doesn't show up on that many different lists of things one can do to improve their health and wellness. But I believe it is incredibly important. Now, my experience with this, again, it goes back to those years I spent working with people who were chronically ill. Getting people to improve their diet, getting them to change their movement routines, or asking them to go for a walk outside, all of these things sounded great in theory. But one thing that would really make everything easier is coming up with a reason why. Why get better? Why get healthy? Why do anything? And ultimately, that boils down to your perceived meaning of life. Now, I'm not talking about what's the meaning of life. I mean, what's your meaning? Identifying why you think life is worth living. Man, is it super important. Without that, we become apathetic at best, depressed at worst. And I use the word meaning and purpose almost interchangeably because you come up with your purpose. What is it you are here to do? Now, this gets into a profoundly philosophical discussion, and it is, but it's an important one, and one of the most important ones to have after we've got the rest of these elements sorted out. Because when you're feeling healthy and vital, well, what then? what do you do with your life? And when you don't have anything to do with your life, it doesn't take long for all of those other elements to start to slip and slide because you've got no reason to maintain them. So focusing on this meaning and purpose. And again, check out the link for different tools on how to start to do this. All right, so that summarizes all of these 7 elements of health. There's a lot of information in there, but take your time. Now, what I mean by take your time is focus on each one of these elements. Maybe you spend a month, maybe you spend 2, maybe you spend a year. Spend time with each of these elements and really focus on improving each one of them incrementally. Don't set these huge lofty goals, just start small. And then with each little small win, you take another step and then another step. Now, I don't want to end this by trying to sell you on something or get you to do something because really you have all the tools that you need. What I do want to tell you is, if you would like some help with this process, then I'm happy to do so. I have a program that's called Elements of Health, and you can check out the link down below. We run these programs twice a year, so if we're in the middle of one or one's already fully booked, just join the waitlist and hop in on the next one. Now, if you like content like this, even though it's a bit out of the ordinary for what we typically do on this channel, please subscribe and like this video. It helps us out a lot, and you'll be kept up to date with any other videos we have that are tips and techniques to help you build a practice you don't want to quit and the skills so you don't have to.